You're about to watch a recorded session from the Brand Podcast Summit. For more recordings or information on the podcasting events we have coming up very soon, go to brandpodcastsummit.com.
The Brand Podcast Summit.
Up next is a subject that I am fascinated by. I think it's a huge blind spot for a ton of brands and creators when it comes to the content they create in all channels. But of course, we're here to talk about podcasting. And so we wanted to make sure that there was something that covered this topic. The topic, of course, is how diverse podcast teams can empower brands. And I immediately thought of Chris to cover this subject when it came up. Chris, let me pull up my notes so I introduce you properly, Chris. Where are we? So Chris is the founder and CEO of DCP, which is an amazing podcasting company. He is a Webby and New York Festival award-winning podcast host, producer, writer, as well as the CEO and founder of DCP, a media agency and production company for underrated voices. He serves on the board of the Podcast Academy, BIPOC Podcast Creators, LWC Studios, and the Podcasting Seriously Award Fund. So I don't know when you take time off, Chris, but you're up to a lot of stuff. So that's awesome. And yeah, Chris uses his position in the industry to create equity and visibility for BIPOC creators. Like I said, I think it's a huge blind spot for so many folks creating podcasts, and I'm really excited to hear what you've got to talk us through on this session, Chris. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Yeah, no, thank you, Harry. I really appreciate you, Jenny, the Lower Street team for having this discussion, just this summit overall, but also making this a priority within today's program. As you said, as the CEO of DCP Entertainment, yes, we are Black-owned and NMSDC certified minority business enterprise, which an acronym I'll talk about a little bit later. But our mission here isn't just to do content for ourselves and our creators, but also to create more of an equitable space for all underrepresented communities, women, people of color, LGBTQ+. And so today's discussion, though it will touch a lot more on the racial equity, especially when it comes to branded podcasts, a lot of these things still apply when we're talking about gender equality within the space, as well as disabled individuals, the largest quote unquote minority when you talk about the human population, not just here in America. I also want to point out just one glaring piece that is missing from my presentation. I just want to be very transparent about it, that most of this conversation will center around Black and Latino creators and audiences, but a lot of these things still apply to Asian Americans and also Indigenous individuals. There just, unfortunately, isn't as much data out there that I was able to pull from. Not to say it doesn't exist, I just had a hard time being able to find it for this conversation. So I just want that to be in mind, that though we're focusing a lot on Black and Latino populations, a lot of these things are things we should be thinking about for those Asian and Indigenous individuals as well.
That's amazing. Thank you for that. Amazing. I've got so much I'd love to chat to you about, but I'm just going to get out of the way and let you do your thing. So thank you, Chris. I will step aside and let you share your screen. Thanks
Wonderful. So much. All right. So let me share here. Oops. I think I got it on. All right. So we already know the name here of this presentation, so we'll skip on ahead here. So throughout this presentation, I want to hit on a few different areas. First, something that probably you're going to see time and time again throughout today's program is just the opportunity for brands to create branded podcasts. The landscape that is there and the audience that exists that wants to hear from you as a brand. Also, we're going to talk about the diversity of the podcast audience, primarily that racial diversity that I mentioned, and then also the opportunities that exist within those particular communities. Then, when we're talking about trying to appeal to those kinds of communities, that necessity to make sure that your team is actually diverse enough to speak from a responsible standpoint and also from a connectivity standpoint with those kinds of audiences. Then also just give you some examples of some great branded podcasts that already exist that were created by production teams that are very diverse. And also, the age-old question that I hear time and time again is, where do you find the teams that are diverse enough to work on these kinds of projects? So I'll give you some resources for that as well. And then just a quick little piece around brand safety and suitability, though it's not particular for just branded podcasts, but something just as I know, brands in the podcast space, this is something that's very important. So I just want to touch on some work that's being done there. So first, talking about that opportunity for brands in the podcast space to create a branded podcast. And this is according to a recent study from Sounds Profitable. So thank you, Sounds Profitable, for helping to gather some of this data for us. But 52% of Americans 18 and older said that they'd listen to a podcast about their favorite TV show or movie. And similarly, 48% of Americans 18 and older said that they listened to a podcast produced by a favorite TV show or movie. So just slight distinction there. But again, you can see about half of Americans, adult Americans, said that they would actually invest in listening to a podcast from their favorite movie or TV show. Similarly, on the brand side, not just in the media space, but if you are just a brand, 41% of adult Americans said they would listen to a podcast about their favorite brand. So there is an appetite out there for these audiences to hear from you and have you bring that call to action to their favorite medium, which happens to be podcasting many times. Looking at just the total U.S. population, 12% of Americans at the time of this study, 12% of Americans are Black. But when you look at fans who are engaged and want to be listeners of branded podcasts, that represents 16% as Black Americans. So it's actually, in a good way, disproportionately Black Americans loving and wanting to hear from branded podcasts. When you look at the Latino population, a similar story. At the time of this study from Sounds Profitable, 17% of the U.S. population was Latino Americans. And then branded podcast fans of that subsection, 20% is Latino Americans. So again, that disproportionate want and need to be able to hear from you, the brands. And so there is some of that opportunity for an engaged audience. Now, going into the financial side of it, because that's obviously what moves the needle for you all, you want to be able to make sure that these are people who want to and have the ability to be able to purchase your content, be able to go see your movies or your shows. So the Latino American buying power is projected to reach $2.6 trillion by 2025. And within Black America is projected to reach $1.98 trillion by 2025. And now when you break that out, when looking at podcast listeners and their, what they do when they listen to a podcast. Obviously, this data I'm going to give you here is more about ads, but I think this is very similar when we talk about actual branded podcasts. And that is that overall podcast listeners, when they hear an ad on a podcast, they went and visited an actual retail location to purchase that product 8.3% of the time. For Latino podcast listeners, it was 10.2%. And for Black podcast listeners, it was 12%. So, this data is a little bit older. I couldn't find any data that was a little bit, more recent in the last, 3 years. But from Nielsen in 2020, this is the data that we were seeing. And I think that's something similar that we've seen, that we're probably going to see as this study gets done again. But just looking at this, we see that this is an engaged audience. These Latino and Black audiences are listening to the calls to action that these shows are giving them because of that connectivity and that passion that they have for the subject matter. So just to take that a little bit further, as we look more at the Latino population, there's 17 million Latino American adult podcast listeners in the last month at the time of this study from Edison Research. 42% of the U.S. Latino American adult podcast listeners say that they pay more attention to advertising on podcasts than any other medium. So this is more than the percentage that you would see from TV or radio or any other of these forms of medium where ads are being displayed to them. 49% of Latino American adult podcast listeners purchased a product or service as a result of hearing a sponsorship or advertisement on a podcast. So almost half of the time when you're reaching those Latino audiences, they're taking that action, which is a really huge number if you really look at how much you're spending versus how much you're going to be able to make. Now, on the Black side, 43% of Black American adults have listened to a podcast in the last month, which is actually 5% higher than the total U.S. population of adults who have listened to a podcast in the last month. So, disproportionately, in a good way, it is a very large swath of that Black audience that is there listening to podcasts. 61% of Black American adult podcast listeners recommended a product to a friend or family member as a result of hearing a sponsorship or advertisement on a podcast. I think this is a really powerful stat when you really think about it, to say that you're not even just reaching that one individual that's listening, or maybe those two people who are listening together. They're then more than half of the time going and recommending this product to other family and friends or other coworkers. Then 52% of Black American podcast listeners went and purchased a product or a service as a result of hearing a sponsorship or advertisement on a podcast, similar to that number that we saw on the Latino side. So almost half of the people that you're reaching from these Black and Latino audiences are taking that action and going out, to get your product. Now, when we think about trying to reach these particular audiences, it's really important that we are staffing them with the kinds of community members that belong to the audiences that we're trying to reach. One of the things anecdotally that I hear from brands that have been in the podcast space has been that they have a little frustration with having to give what's called cultural notes to the production teams that they're working with. And what I mean by that is, things that if you were part of the audience community that you are trying to reach, you would know certain touch points and certain messaging that, you should or should not be using. Now, I'm hearing this a lot of times from individuals who belong to say, the Black community for a podcast that's going to then try to reach the Black community. But luckily in those situations, the brand has somebody on their team who's able to catch that. What can be, unfortunately, really bad in this situation is if you have a brand who, doesn't have members from the community, and you also have a production team who doesn't have members from that community trying to reach said community, you end up in a situation where you don't have those gatekeepers to be able to say, oh, wait, maybe we're doing something wrong here. And what can happen is that you maybe don't connect with that audience as well as possible. You don't have that authentic connection. You might, unfortunately, have situations where you're being insensitive, or even worse, you could actually be being offensive to those audiences and doing the exact opposite with what you're trying to do with your campaign. So you might end up spending money and hurting your brand. So that is what is at stake when it comes to having diverse teams when trying to reach diverse communities. But just to get more into some stats, around just that engagement from audiences when it comes to making sure there's representation within these podcasts, is that 63% of Black American adults podcast listeners find it important that podcasts include Black stories and perspectives. 50% of Black American adult podcast listeners find it important that podcasts are hosted by a Black host, and 48% of Latino American adult podcast listeners feel the same way. Now, these stats are obviously, more situated around these diverse hosts. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data to be able to point to say what happens when you have diverse production companies or freelancers working on these projects. But I think this is indicative of is if you think about this in the same way as doing an ad on a podcast, we understand that that's essentially what this is pointing to. And why these numbers are so high is because a lot of times when we are writing this copy for the host to be able to do, we're empowering them to make it their own. We're empowering them to be able to put this in their own words, to speak to their audience in a way that is going to connect to them because of the subject matter or because of the communities that they belong to. Well, the same rule applies when you're trying to create a series for a podcast. You should have a production team helping you with the concept creation, helping you with the structure of the format, helping you with the things that are going to connect to that audience in a way that if you don't belong to that community, you may not know how to be able to connect with. So I think that is what is that these stats can help you to be able to see without us being able to truly point to what the engagement can be when you have a diverse production company attached.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really want to let you know that if you're enjoying this content, you're going to love what we have coming up very soon. Another brand podcasting event that goes even deeper into what we're discussing in this session. So for more information on that, please go to brandpodcastsummit.com. And if you're watching this session and you're finding yourself thinking, this is all great, but how am I going to get this started this week? I need some help with my brand's podcast. We'd love to have a chat about what you're working on. You can find all the information on how to contact us at lowerstreet.co. We also have a bunch of case studies and some examples of the things that we've been working on to give you a sense of what that looks like. So if you want help with your brand podcast, go to lowerstreet.co. And now back to what you're watching. Thanks.
Now, there's a lot of great examples of branded podcasts out there. So I definitely encourage you to check this out. And one thing I forgot to mention here at the top is at the end of this, I'll have a QR code. You can scan it to be able to go to our website, where on our banner on our homepage, there's a downloadable version of this document. Within that, you can get access to all the different studies that I'm mentioning here. Also, at the same time, here on this page, you can click on these individual shows to be able to take you to an opportunity to listen to what these diverse production companies were able to create with their partners, as well as some of these resources that I'll get into here in a second. So the first one I want to point to is Roundabout, a series created by State Farm, a branded project where they partnered with Acast. who then reached out to DCP, my company, to help on the production side, as they want to reach more BIPOC audiences by telling the stories of Black and brown podcasters and their crazy road stories. So it's a very fun, entertaining kind of situation. But ACAST brought us in to make sure that we're telling those stories in an authentic way, in a way that it's going to connect to those audiences. Black Blood Heals is a project that is obviously health-oriented from a health organization where they partnered with a Black female-owned company called Adode Media, where they employed Adode to be able to come in and make sure that not only were they structuring the podcast episodes properly, they were actually helping with the overall structure for how they're going to release episodes, timing of things to make sure you're hitting on when these audiences are going to be most engaged. So it goes beyond just creating the content, but also the strategy that goes into reaching audiences when they're most susceptible to being heard, or susceptible to hearing your messaging. There's also Into the Mix, which is a branded podcast from Ben & Jerry's, which in their first season, through their partnership with Vox also subcontracted with a company called ABF Creative, another Black-owned media company, to be able to set the tone for what that series is and was. Obviously, they're still going now, but they really helped set the tone early on for what that series was going to be, and as inclusive as it would be as it continued to move on. I also think that a lot of times we think about branded podcasts as things that are just these standalone series, like I just mentioned. But branded podcasts are also, branded episodes that can run on multiple different series. An example of that is what Dell did back in 2022 for their Podference, where they commissioned a bunch of different podcasts reaching Black communities to showcase the talent and the success of Black small businesses around the country. And so one of those shows that they bought into was Torre's show, one of our shows, and they did a branded episode that was allowing us to tell these stories of great Black small businesses, but again, get that messaging out of the work that Dell is doing and the championing of these Black small businesses. So, we can also think outside the box when we talk branded podcasts. And one thing I want to point out when it comes to these shows, there are definitely more examples of shows like this out there. But as I really reached out to a lot of my network here in the podcast community, I got a lot more people telling me that they've never been approached or have never had the opportunity to work in branded podcasts, even though they would love to. And I think there's unfortunately not a lot of great examples, or there's not enough great examples to point to of opportunities where these diverse podcast creators are able to actually work on these projects and be able to elevate your brand in the way that they could. The other thing I also want to point out here too is specifically these pieces that I'm pointing to, as well as some of the ones I didn't put up here. Almost all of them are catering specifically to a Black or Latino audience. But let's think about making sure that teams are diverse, even when we're trying to reach a total population of a total U.S. population. Because unless you think your brand is specifically only for white Americans or white men, we need to make sure that those teams that are working on it are also diverse, just as diverse as the American population is. So don't just hire these diverse teams when you're trying to reach a specific Black or Latino or Asian or Indigenous kind of audience. Make sure that we're doing that kind of diversity, making sure the team is diverse, even when we're trying to reach the total U.S. population. And I know a lot of times that isn't necessarily in your hands. Sometimes you have a third party that is there helping to set the budgets or work with different creators. So make sure your third party is also helping with that as well. And one other piece I'll mention too is don't think that because you're going to a diverse production company that you're doing it to get a discount for yourself. I've unfortunately been in situations and know other networks as well that are being paid 1/3 the amount that that they pay other production companies. So going to these diverse content creators, these freelancers, is not a way to get a discount. If anything, you might want to be paying them a little bit more because they are helping you to reach an audience that you might otherwise not know how to, or might not have the ability to be able to reach in a responsible way. Now, the age-old question that I hear time and time again is, where do I find these people? I don't have them within my network. So what is the best way to reach them? This is just some of the resources that are available to you. One is the acronym I mentioned here at the top, the NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council. This is the council that actually certifies minority-owned companies. This is not the only way to represent that you're a minority company, but they are definitely one of the leaders in doing so. On their platform, you can search their database to find minority-owned companies to be able to help you not only just in podcasting, but even on the legal side of things, marketing. They're a really great organization to make sure from a total perspective, you're working with these diverse teams. They are an organization that you do have to partner with to be able to access that database. But again, I highly encourage it because of the upside just beyond the podcasting space. There's also the BIPOC podcast creators, where they actually have a database on their website where you can search different companies that are diverse and have the ability to help you on your production. Them, along with the Black Podcasters Association, Black Pod Collective, and Asian American Podcasters Association, you can reach out to them directly as well through their email, through their website to say, hey, I'm working on this kind of project. Do you know any freelancers or any companies that might fit the bill for what we're trying to do and the audiences that we're trying to reach? So don't be shy. They're very, easy to work with, as well as the Women of Color podcasters, also called the WOC podcasters. Similar situation where they have an online database, but also you can reach out to them directly. Air Media, more of a public, more known in the public radio space, but they also represent a lot of independent editors, hosts, other individuals who are working on these productions, producers, who you can look on their database to find individuals. But again, you can reach out to them directly to get more information on individuals and diverse teams that you can work with. The last thing I want to mention here, just knowing that many of you here in this space aren't just trying to do branded podcasts, but you also are advertising on podcasts, and we appreciate you for helping us to maintain this industry, is around brand safety and suitability, something that is becoming bigger and bigger, definitely more of a necessity, and something that we know is something that keeps you all safe when trying to find the right shows and episodes and topics to be able to speak on. This is definitely a great tool, but it's something that is still, needs some fine tuning. And many of you may have seen towards the end of last year, the study that came out from Sounder and also Urban One that showcased that as Sounder looked at the Urban One catalog, they used these brand safety tools, at least the ones that are currently available, and they demonetized their content by 95%. That is a huge amount for a company like Urban One, who is actually regulated by the FCC. So if they're seeing those kinds of disparaging results, what does that then say for independent creators and smaller creators? So, this is not to say that the tools don't work and shouldn't be there, but there is definitely a way to fine tune them. And so we're working with Barometer on a few different initiatives. One of them is a really big initiative that we're doing here that is all around driving equity in audio through transparency. We're actually engaging not only the content creators and publishers, but also the technology side here in the podcast industry, as well as brands like yourselves to come together and figure out what is the solution that works for everybody. So we're actually having our first meeting, and we'd love to have more partners involved. Our first meeting is in January 31st at 1:30 p.m. Even if that's not something that you can be able to commit to in terms of that first meeting, please reach out to me or go to the link here on that contact us page, which actually just takes you to the contact page for DCP. Ask me about it. I will get you connected with this group. There hasn't been an official press release, so that's why I'm being a little cagey about the language I use here. But it is something that's going to be announced fairly soon. And we really appreciate Barometer for taking this conversation so seriously and bringing so many of us together. And again, we really need you as brands to be part of this conversation. So as I wrap, here, I just want to say, again, I really appreciate you all being part of this conversation, being engaged, and also at the same time, just being transparent with the omittance here of, Asian American and Indigenous individuals. The same thing definitely applies to them as well. We shouldn't just be thinking about diversity when it comes to Black and Latino audiences and creators. With that, if there's any questions, I'd love to hear them. Any comments? I am here.
Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for your talk. That was so interesting. And thank you for, giving us all the stats. That was so interesting, and definitely nothing that I had access to before. Right, so as I put up the questions, I actually had one of my own that I wanted to start with. I was just wondering, looking at 2024, it's a brand new year. I was wondering what trends or innovations do you foresee in podcasting advertising, especially when it comes to diversity, and how can brands adapt their strategies around this just to make sure that they are being as inclusive as possible. So you've talked a lot about having the right team for it around it and having the right mindset. But when it comes to the new trend of 2024, what would be your best recommendations?
And I apologize. What was the first part of your question?
Oh, sorry. Looking forward to 2024, I was wondering, what are the trends or innovations you foresee in podcast advertising that could help you, being more diverse in your approach, especially as a brand?
I think part of it is the resources and the access to said resources. I think, even though the brand safety and suitability is more on the ad side, companies like Barometer and Sounder are connected to both the advertising side and the production companies and publishers, and they can act as a great third party to help us connect. So I think as we are starting to work together on some of these initiatives, it's helping us also connect a little bit more and be able to know who exists in these spaces. So I think if anything, I think those trends are some of the things that are going to open up these opportunities a little bit more.
That's so true. Thank you so much. And in the audience, we've got Alex, who is wondering, how do you see the trends you mentioned at the start of your session evolving in the future, audience composition, etc.? And what do you think the opportunities are for brands in this space?
Yeah, one thing I didn't put up there are just some of the trends when it comes to the growing audiences. So Latino audiences and actually Asian American audiences are some of the fastest growing audiences in the podcasting space. Edison Research has done a lot around that. I think Sounds Profitable, some of their data points to that, but also Black Americans as well. So the audiences are growing on both of those sides, and that is creating more of an audience that is inclusive, which then means, as trying to reach them, you want to have those diverse teams. So I think those are some of the trends that we're seeing there. And then, there is not enough data around Black buying power. The last digital buying power study that I saw was back in 2019, and that's why I didn't include that here. But back then, that was actually showcasing that particularly Black and Latino audiences are some of the leaders in digital purchasing. And when we think about podcasting, this is usually something that's done on your phone, maybe even on your computer, but a lot of time on your phone. So if you're going to take an action, you're doing it digitally, as opposed to just going into a store, even though I did have those, going into a retail stats up there. So I want to see more data that will help to point to that. But the data that existed back in 2019 was showing that these diverse audiences are the ones that are taking those digital actions. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be another trend that we continue to see here.
That's so cool. Thank you so much, Chris. So we've got quite a few questions from the audience. Sorry. Corinne is wondering, do you have any insight into why those purchase and recommend stats are so high for Black and Latino audiences in comparison to other groups, maybe?
To be completely honest, I don't know. I think it's just, I think part of it, honestly, is because I think a lot of the things that we're seeing is there are a lot of times these companies are going to advertising companies that actually are representing those communities. So the messaging is just authentic. So I think that is the most powerful thing. I think also we're in this age of influencer marketing. So I think a lot of that data is probably tied to that. And so, I think very much of the podcast landscape as influencers. We just happen to be in the audio influencer space. And so I think that's some of the things that you're seeing there is that, there's a trust level between the host and the audience, or the social media influencer and the audience. And I think that's what's helping to spur that purchasing power there. But to be completely honest, I wasn't part of those studies, so I can't actually speak to the exact reasons. Those are just, my hypotheses on the things.
That's so good and very helpful. Thank you, Chris. And actually, Victory is asking whether we've seen a growth, particularly in the Gen Z BIPOC listeners group, as opposed to any other group.
Absolutely, yeah. There is a huge, and there actually are, straight studies around Gen Z. If you want to message me later, I can point you to some of those areas. My email is colbert@dcpentertainment.com. I can definitely point you to some of those studies. But Gen Z is a huge audience that is growing. It's actually in the age ranges, the fastest growing audience in podcasting, and one that actually has much different data than you see for other audiences. So I know we only have so much time, so I can't get into all the specific data, but I'd be very happy to send you over those studies.
All right. So what's the best way for people to reach out to you? Maybe through LinkedIn?
Yes, LinkedIn is good. Also directly through my email, Colbert, COLBERT @dcpentertainment.com. Also, if you go to dcpofficial.com, we have a contact page there as well. That will then reach me too.
All right. Really helpful. Thank you, Chris.
And also just one quick reminder again, if you want this presentation, go to dcpofficial.com. It's up on that homepage. You can download it there, which also has a QR code and direct links to a lot of the data that I pointed to here.
Perfect. Thank you. And so we've got an anonymous attendee who's asking, actually a very good question. So when we talk about Latino audiences, does that largely point to non-English, Spanish and Portuguese speaking content? Or is that for, Latino speaking Spanish, but also English?
It points to both, but there is data that I did not put up here that is in the Latino podcaster study that Edison Research did in conjunction with SiriusXM and also with LWC Studios that points to, I think it's around 55% of Latino audiences say that they are more engaged when it is Spanish speaking. And so when they don't necessarily say this, the whole podcast has to be Spanish speaking, but I think it can be a situation that's very bilingual within those conversations. So I think part of that is it just shows that authenticity. It showcases like, hey, a lot of these Spanish, Latino Americans, a lot of times are speaking both English and Spanish in their conversations, literally within the same sentence at sometimes. And so, I think that authenticity within the content is why you're seeing that. But again, I think it's around 55% of those audiences saying that they're even more engaged when there's some sort of Spanish speaking within the content.
All right, thank you so much. That's really helpful. Now, so someone's asking a question that, so Michael, sorry, is asking if you are aware of any international BIPOC networks outside of the US.
Yes. So there is crap, now I'm going to feel really bad. It's my friends over in Africa. AfriPods. So AfriPods, AFRIPODS. AfriPods is one of the largest organizations working out of Africa. They have a huge network of podcasters, individual and also podcast networks, within their entire community. There are definitely others. I don't know all of them off the top of my head. I would say that I think it's a smaller percentage than you see here in America. I don't think it's something that's been as huge of necessarily, I won't say huge as an initiative, but it isn't being publicized as much as, say, here in America as we do. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a whole bunch to give you there, but AfriPods is probably a good start in terms of at least, people representing the African continent. I will, just to go back to your other question real quick around, the language piece. Don't, also then think about the language piece as not just trying to translate your audio and putting up the exact same content. So, just using AI to translate your content. You actually want to work directly with the company that does translation because there's cultural nuances to language and words and even certain phrases that won't translate over. So you really want to work with a team that will help you to make sure that the content actually holds up with the actual Spanish speaking translation culturally, not just from a language perspective.
It sounds like you've hit the mark with AfriPods. A lot of fans out there of the network. Thank you so much, Chris. Right, I've got one last question that could be a bit controversial, but I'm sure you've got a very great opinion about it. Someone with Anonymous is asking if a podcast focuses too much on diversity, could it turn off some of the audiences? Well, actually, specifically, is asking if it could turn off more people than it would turn on or attract some of the listeners. How do you keep that reach away from from coming across as too political, perhaps?
So, it's a very real question. I think, it depends on how you approach that content. And also it depends on what is your actual mission. Are you just specifically trying to reach a certain population? And if so, then don't worry about trying to get everybody. You want to speak as much to that niche audience as possible to make sure that you're, getting that messaging across to them. That said, I think Roundabout is a really great example where, yes, we're highlighting basically all BIPOC podcast creators, but when you listen to it, it's not just saying like, hey, I'm Black, hey, I'm Latino, this is my Latino. It's like, no, these are just incredible stories. These people just happen to be Black and Latino. And so I think you can approach your content that way. And that's what resonates with audience was when they see representation, true representation in the content, that is what keeps them engaged. And you can do so in a way that isn't preachy. And so, yeah, I would encourage you to check out Roundabout as a great example. It actually was nominated for Best Branded Podcast last year. So I'm not just saying that because we would help produce it, but I think Acast and State Farm were really intentional. Shout out to Shantae Howell over at Acast for how intentionally, she worked with the State Farm team to make that podcast that didn't alienate other audiences.
Definitely a great pod recommendation. Thank you, Chris, and a great answer as well. Now, it's not exactly an answer, but someone was making a comment in the chat a little bit earlier about, the fact that there are only two of them working on their podcast. So they feel like, it's a heavy lift. And so how can you, even as a small team, make an effort to be, to be more diverse and include more representation in your podcast?
Yeah, and I get that. I think, sometimes there's those budget constraints. And so if you only have the money to be able to have two people working on the podcast, I would definitely reach out, if possible, reach out to other people in your network, or reach out to maybe some of those communities that I mentioned to say, hey, I'm working on this podcast. We want to make sure that it's representative for these certain communities. Are there any individuals or you in particular, could I send you an episode, even have, make sure you signed NDAs and all that, make sure stuff isn't leaking out. But, can I send this to you to just give it a listen? Would that be okay? And also, if you have the ability, it would be great if you can, compensate them for that consulting time. That would be great. But again, I think if you can utilize your own network to make sure that you have some other ears on it that might not come from the communities that you're a part of, I think that can be really important. So, one could be hiring a consultant to help with that. But two, if you don't have that budget, trying to reach out to people and reach out to more than just one person. You don't want to make someone feel like they are the representative for their entire race or their entire gender. That's also a horrible feeling, and also doesn't necessarily get you the kind of results that you need.
That's a great advice. Thank you so much, Chris. And with that, I think we ran out of questions. Sorry, there was quite a fefew. But are there any closing remarks or words that you'd like to make today?
No, I think just to reiterate again, I think, I feel it's very important to say over and over, this conversation applies to both Asian American and also Indigenous individuals as well. Let's not just think about diversity when it comes to Black and Latino. And then just also the piece of, especially for larger brands and third parties that you may be working with, let's make sure that as we're employing these diverse teams, we're not we're not discounting what they bring to the table financially, because unfortunately we see that time and time again. And so, make sure we're compensating them properly, or at least compensating them in the same way that you would any other production company.
That's very true. Thank you so much, Chris. That was very, very insightful, and a lot of love for you and your talk session in the chat. So with that, I'll leave it to Harry.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Stephen.
Don't forget, if you need help with your brand's podcast, we'd love to have a chat. You can find us at lowerstreet.co. If you'd like more content like this, or to find out information on podcasting events we have coming up in the near future, head to brandpodcastsummit.com.